So,
Right.
welcome to another episode of Khalidia Show.
Another exciting episode.
Another
This
exciting
time
episode.
I'm wearing a hat.
Yeah,
When you're
looks
as
good,
bald
bro.
as me, you wear a hat sometimes.
What is that?
When you're bald like me, you wear a hat sometimes. It takes off the shine.
You seem like you're cold. You got a jacket on and you got your hat. It's almost like fall clothing.
Well, it's not that warm in my underground layer here.
Oh, okay. Okay. I mean, it's pretty warm everywhere else, but
and
yeah, it makes
maybe
sense.
if the conversation gets too heated, you'll know it because I'll take my hat off. There you go. You
Right,
see, this is a new gimmick.
right.
Showmanship.
Right, right. So
We're in
we
showbiz
wanted
now, huh?
to talk about Afghanistan today.
Yeah, another happy issue. We're talking about happy stuff.
Well, it's an interesting issue because it's been a long forgotten issue, and now it's come up, and um, yeah,
Well, forgotten, not really forgotten, but sort of stuffed in the closet. You know,
well,
like it's always been there. It's not
been
forgotten
there, but
for the
like
people that
people, I
are
mean,
like serving in the
forgotten, yeah,
military.
forgotten. People just are like out of sight, out of mind. We don't want to think about it. It's one of those things we just want to,
Well,
not
this
think
is one of
about.
the things that I think side tangent here. One of the things that I think is a problem with having an all volunteer army military is that the rest of society can forget about it. So people volunteer for the military, and
Mhm.
they go and get maimed and traumatized in foreign countries, and they come back and it's like people are like, "Oh, there's still a war going on? I didn't even remember that. Like that was even." I mean, there are a lot of people that are going around talking smack today that like weren't even born when this war started.
Right, but I think that
20-year-old war.
there is something unique. I hear what you're saying that if it's not a volunteer army. If you had a draft situation, it would be different. People would feel it different, kind of like
You'd be less
if
likely to
you
be
had
going into war
right,
because
like if you had the situation kind of like Vietnam. But the difference is
yeah.
that Vietnam, you had much higher numbers
Mm.
and yeah, and much higher casualties. So you're gonna. I mean, you have to like keep
No,
that
no,
in
I mean,
mind.
yeah, but Afghanistan has had a lot of casualties. They just
Look, nothing compared. Like, I mean, very little compared to Vietnam. Like
I'd
Vietnam
have to
is
look
like
at the number. Yeah, I mean, I'm
fifty
not sure the
thousand
exact number.
plus. Afghanistan was like maybe I think not more than 5,000.
What?
But
For
yeah,
the
the
entire
numbers.
20 years?
Yeah, it's not that high. It's
No,
not that.
I'm pretty sure we can look that up. Hold
Look
on.
it up. I don't think it's that high. I mean, I've read in um, multiple sources that it was, compared to Vietnam, um, right, Afghanistan, U.S. troop losses. Let's see, 2,312. So, it's actually, yeah, losses are actually pretty low, relatively speaking. But here's the other thing. When you compare it, I think like an interesting comparison would be to Iraq. So Iraq had similarly not very high numbers in terms of losses compared to Vietnam. Again, I think so that higher than Afghanistan, but still nothing like in the five digits or anything. Uh,
Sure.
so, but the thing with Iraq, though, it seemed like there was a lot more attention paid to that conflict in the sense that it seems like the government was trying to was pumping more money into people learning Arabic, people going to Iraq to develop, like, I don't know, cultural awareness or what have you. It seems that there was just a lot more interest in Iraq. I mean, there's definitely a lot more interest in Iraq's resources. I would imagine that. There's a lot more
Yeah,
we were able to extract out of Iraq.
no, I mean, I think you're right, and I think that there's a sexiness to and I use that not in like a literal sense, but there's something more attractive about the war in Iraq, even though it was pointless in most ways.
Yeah.
And but let's hold on. Let's dial back and restart here. For instance, like we're talking about Afghanistan. Afghanistan, like it was the first war on terror war,
Hmm.
um, and it's been going on for 20 years. So if we're talking about Afghanistan, uh, you have to sort of look at like what we're, and so this is all within you know um, the light of the fact that okay, the point that we're talking about it is that the Biden administration pulled out in the middle of the night at like 3 a.m. They abandoned Bagram Air Force Base, and so they were talking about pulling out, but they didn't really give the local security uh, the military, the security guys, like they didn't give them a heads up. They disappeared in the middle of the night. They left vehicles, like armored vehicles and cars, without the keys.
Yeah, and there
They
was a
just
bunch of
bounced.
looting that happened right after they left,
Yeah,
with the all that gear and equipment that was supposed to be left to the Afghan forces. But yeah,
but they just bounced in the middle of the night,
right. Um,
which is kind of a rude thing to do after being there for 20 years. It's like you've been married for 20 years and then you just like your wife wakes up and you're gone.
yeah. Well, let's start with why that war started. So
Okay.
like, you had touched upon this a little bit in the aftermath of 9/11. It was the first war in the war on terror. So since for the people who, I guess, like you said, weren't even born,
Yeah.
when it started, that was where Al Qaeda was operating out of primarily, and yeah, they were going to hunt down Osama bin Laden and exterminate. The idea was to exterminate Al Qaeda and take out the Taliban for harboring Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. So what uh, what eventually happened, and I think that there's something to be said, and I think that we can talk about this throughout this conversation. This is like maybe an underlying theme, which is the limited understanding that the US has of foreign wars, right? Especially
Yes.
when it comes to dealing with an idea so vague
Hallelujah.
like terrorism.
Go
Like,
tell it.
yeah, I mean, it's like, okay,
No, I
so
mean,
you have an objective. You wanted to hunt down Osama bin Laden. You wanted to go after his organization. Great. Okay, so he eventually was killed, right? But this
in
is not. This
Pakistan.
is not. Al Qaeda isn't, and was never just a bunch of dudes in a cave, like organizing to plot, terrorist operations.
They never had.
It's an idea. It's an idea, and it's something that has spread so widely, not just in Afghanistan, not just in neighboring Pakistan, throughout the Middle East, throughout other parts of the Muslim world, and even parts of Europe. We could even talk about it spreading in other areas too, sub-Saharan Africa. The idea
Uh,
is that if there is so much um, oppression committed by governments that are pro-Western and are by autocrats that are installed by by Western powers that do the West's bidding, whereby economically speaking, so many people suffer in those many countries. This is what happens. Gangs form in inner cities when they people aren't able to find
When they're
jobs, get
underserved.
educated. Right. This is the equivalent of that. Gangs of people who are basically criminals who have nothing else to do
Well,
and no
I
other
mean,
way to survive.
I think you could sort of cast international terrorism as sort of the globalized version of gangs.
Yeah.
In that, like gangs gangs come about through, underserved communities that, turn to criminal activities and find different ways to make money, and then find different loyalties and build networks, you know within their communities. And global terrorism is the globalized version of that. And it's like, if you want a globalized world, you're going to have globalized criminality and globalized militancy. um Within Afghanistan, like, you know uh this this war started, this started a long time ago. The American war there started in 2001, but, you know, the war for Afghanistan started a long time before that. And it was part of, like, it depends on how, again, like, I feel like this is a running theme in the things that we talk about, is like, how far back do we want to go? Because there was a time, you know, when a few hundred years ago, when within Afghanistan, like, you had Jews, Zoroastrians, Muslims of Sunni and Shia, you know, proclivities. You had there was even, there was an area of Afghanistan that they called Kafiristan.
What?
There was Kafiristan,
Oh
which
wow.
is where people that were still polytheists, you know. And we could spend a whole podcast talking about what the word kafir really means.
Yeah, yeah.
But
In this context, just people who are polytheists.
yeah, people
Interesting.
that are not monotheists. But there was a section of Afghanistan that was called, like, Kafiristan, and
Yeah.
it was the people that never, came to monotheist religions. And then you had Buddhists and you had Hindus, and um, you know, but there
Well,
were
I
like
think
traditional polytheists that, like, had their own area, and
I
they
think
lived together all right for
yeah.
a long time.
I think a good starting point, I mean, and yes, this is a recurring theme, but a good starting point, in my opinion, would be looking at um, the Soviet invasion, right? And but
Well, that's yeah.
before that, I want to talk a little bit about the the idea of how Islamist groups and their acceptance into a democratic system in theory should look like versus how it has actually panned out in different countries. But I want to like look at, like, let's say Egypt, for example. Egypt, where you had the Muslim Brotherhood being one of the oldest political parties. I don't know if it was the oldest, but one of the oldest for sure, going back to, was it the early 20th century. But the idea is that it was one of the oldest and best organized political parties and had a lot of really educated members. And then the when Nasser came about and basically overthrew the monarchy in Egypt, he was a secularist and he brought in a bunch of military guys like him who were secularists. And so there was this tension between the Muslim Brotherhood and Nasser. But the idea is that eventually, I don't know where you may know more about this than I do, but they eventually tried to assassinate him, and he threw a whole bunch of them in prison, and they were like, a lot of them were tortured like crazy. And so
There was a
they
lot of torturing and executions,
there's a lot
and
of
executions of people that
brutal
didn't have
violence.
to be. You know,
Sorry, sorry, what?
like they executed a lot of people that really weren't involved in politics. They were just ideologues, authors that wrote books. You know what I mean? They
Right.
weren't leading an organization or something like that, and
And
they got.
they forced the organization to go underground for decades and become a lot more radical in response. But for those who were in prison, who weren't executed, who were brutally tortured, who eventually did manage to come out of prison, those guys were pretty. I mean, they were pretty much same thing, radicalized a whole lot more, but also they had a bone to pick, obviously. And the person I'm thinking of the most is Zawahiri, right? And leaving prison in Egypt and going straight to Afghanistan, which is when the Soviet invasion was going on, and the Mujahideen were being
Mm.
formed, and Bin Laden was there, a bunch of other actors were there. And this is, we can get into now, like, where the American and Saudi involvement
Well,
came in.
I mean, here's the thing, and I'm going to get into the Saudi thing, and I know, I dive deep into that, but I think to put it in sort of a linear perspective, Afghanistan was historically, like, it's been invaded throughout its history by many different people. It's been involved in Indian, Indian armies have invaded it. Alexander the Great invaded. So many civilizations have invaded, and so many militaries have invaded throughout history. And then you get to like the 19th century, and you have like the British East India Company, which I love. And this is sort of, it could be its own podcast, is the British East India Company, because the British East India Company was basically uh, running wars. They were starting wars for business interests to get access to resources. And then the actual Royal, Navy had to come in and back them up and save them. They were pulling the United Kingdom and the British Empire into wars for their British interests. But they were usually the ones that started it. They would go in and start some shit, and then the British military would come in to back them up. And that's, the British East India Company came from India into Afghanistan and start shit. Um, but getting into the British East India Company is its own, its own conversation. But when we're talking about the history of the wars in Afghanistan, uh, in a modern context, after the British left, and they've all left. The Afghans are very proud that all the invaders eventually leave. They get tired and leave
Mm.
because they don't give up
Graveyard of
fighting.
empires.
Yeah, exactly. But if we're starting with the Soviets, like that's where you wanted to.
Yeah, what I wanted to get into is, I mean, this obviously this was during the Cold War,
Uh,
and when the Soviets got involved, there was obviously a reaction in Afghanistan, and it was, it's a very, I mean, parts of Afghanistan, especially the rural areas, from what I understand, are very conservative. and traditional, and the vast majority of people in Afghanistan are Muslim, and so the resistance that was formed was this idea that was promoted by, I think it may have been like a local idea, but was heavily funded and armed by the Americans and Saudis, right? And that they wanted to counter any Soviet influence. The Americans, from the perspective of just countering any Soviet influence anywhere in the world, the Saudis seeing a spread of communism in an area that might eventually spread from there. So if communism took over Afghanistan, their worry was that it would spread to other parts of the region and eventually move towards the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, which they had their issues with. I
Yeah,
don't I
well,
don't I don't pretend to know all the details of the Saudi involvement or why they got involved, but suffice it to say from my perspective that they did get involved. There was a lot of funding, and part of that element was the presence of bin Laden and other very rich and wealthy
okay,
donors.
so there's a very interesting thing there. And okay, so for instance, like the the Pakistani you know security organizations and like military security, intelligence has been very involved in Afghanistan, and Pakistan is very much like trying to like has tried to use the Taliban as sort of puppet army um for their own interests, which is there's an interesting thing developing right now because India has who against Pakistan's um best interests is has been making direct or indirect contact with the Taliban and having talks with them, and that's sort of what's happening right now is the Taliban is becoming today uh, legitimized, like recognized as a political force that is going to be a part of the future of the country.
Yeah, so are
Um,
the Russians and the Chinese, by the way. They're reaching out and talking to warlords, and yeah.
yeah, and NATO is willing to talk to them and host negotiations, that kind of stuff. And Turkey, and there's a whole thing about Turkey being involved. Turkey has offered to stay on and uh, keep a contingent to guard the international airport. Um, like the Taliban's major thing has always been get the foreigners out, and there's a lot of talk about whether or not they've changed their ideology since the 90s when they were very militant and uh, had a bad human rights record, and there's a lot of talk that maybe they've changed or maybe they haven't changed. But if we're putting it in historical perspective, where the Taliban showed up, this was because if you look back at photos and of Afghanistan, and you look at photos of Kabul um, during like the 50s and 60s, it could have been you'd see these pictures and I get that could have been a European city, that could have been Cairo, that could have been you know it was very like you didn't see women walking around in burqas, and it wasn't like people living in caves like that. This is the image that the world has because of the wars, but I mean the urban centers were very nice and clean, and you had women walking around dressed like fucking Jackie Kennedy. So uh this you know, in terms of the modern era, you had it was really with like the communist parties and the Soviet intervention or invasion to support the communist government, and you had a real division between the rural areas and the urban areas. And this is not like that uncommon in these type of situations. Even like if you look at a map, like for like right now, as of last I read today, the Taliban is saying, okay, we control 85% of the country, which may be true in terms of logistically they actually have control over certain areas. However, the areas that they control are mostly rural and not very highly populated, and the areas they don't control are highly populated. And it's sort of like when you look at a map of the US and you look at places that are Trump country, places that Donald, Trump is really popular, but parts of Wisconsin and Alabama, pick a state that if you just color the states on a map and say, oh, Donald Trump won these, geographically it's larger areas, but there aren't that many people living there. And the people that are not supporting that are in densely populated urban areas. So in other words, the majority of the population is not for you. And if you have control of like all of this sparsely populated rural land, it doesn't mean you have the support of the people, because most of the
Well, I
people
mean,
live in densely populated cities.
right, but I think the thing to keep in mind here with the Taliban is that yeah, they did come from a rural background. From what I read, it was southern and eastern Afghanistan,
Mm.
um, from the Pashtun areas. So they're largely ethnically Pashtun. So, but the thing is that those areas are pretty vast, and yeah, like you, as you said, but if you're comparing to two or three cities, I mean, you have enough numbers of them to overwhelm not just the American to have overwhelmed the American presence, but also the Afghan forces that the Americans supported. I mean, it was just wave after wave after wave, and it didn't matter how
Well,
many of
they're
them.
very aggressive.
They are aggressive, but what I'm saying is that they also have numbers, and
Mm.
so I'm not saying maybe
Numbers
those
in
are
terms
more
of fighters.
like yeah fighters rather than just overall population. But the thing that I want to get at is looking at, well, how that came about. So the Taliban were seen as representing the rural poor, right? And seeing that these people suffered when the city folks were doing really well, as you
Yeah,
put it.
and they represent the traditional values and that.
Right, right. And then they also were supported from the beginning by Pakistani intelligence, right? And
Yeah.
so Pakistan's interests in Afghanistan are quite complex. I'm not going to pretend like I know all of them, but I do know that there are ethnic connections there also between Pakistani Pashtuns and Afghan Pashtuns. So there's that element, but then there is also possibly a security element. I'm sure there was a security element, especially when we were talking about the Soviet presence. And if it was the Pakistanis getting involved, then there's from my knowledge of Pakistani intelligence operations, Not always, but a lot of times you see Saudi involvement,
Okay, the
right? And
hat's coming off.
so what I'm getting at is that, all right, so you have this group that just gets all this support, and we're talking beyond
Well,
the
American CIA support.
yeah, we're talking beyond the Soviet invasion now. This is we're talking in the 90s. And so to go around and spreading in madrasas and
Yeah, but
not allowing for the country to be, I don't know, loyal to um, outside influences that are not traditional or not conservative, more
well,
liberal.
it's not so much a loyalty, I think, as um, whatever gets you to the point you want to be. But the thing about the Saudis, and this is what, like, the Saudis and the Pakistanis have been sticking their dicks in here in Afghanistan for decades, and it's it's well documented. The Saudis, and this is where, and this is the thing when we're talking about international terrorism, the Afghans have really not been involved in international terrorism. There were no Afghans on the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. They were Saudis and Egyptians, and uh, there were no Afghans there. There aren't a lot of Afghans in Al Qaeda, and I mean, eh, the the Taliban and the Afghan resistance, whatever you think of them and how they treat women and what they think of human rights, and whether or not they've changed or they haven't changed, whatever. But the point is, they haven't like been exporting their ideas and their revolution. They haven't been attacking anybody. Their whole uh, mission is to make the world the way they want it to be in their country. The international terrorism situation was something that came out of, like, there was a in during the 80s and 90s civil war fight with the different there were a lot of different factions that were fighting against Soviet influence in Afghanistan, and they didn't like Soviets coming in to protect the communist government. And so it rallied a lot of rural people, and like, this is our country, we don't need you communists from Russia coming in. And but it's really always been about their country. Now the Saudis you know took it as the and there's a particular problem with Saudi Arabia, in that they have a lot of time on their hands,
Well,
and
you,
it
well,
became like it became a tourist industry, like literally, like it was like a militant tourist industry where they would take their wives sometimes,
mhm.
like people like from Saudi Arabia would take their wives, they'd go to Afghanistan, they'd go to the gun market, buy some guns, they'd go to and go to, like, whatever counted as a car dealership at that time in Afghanistan, and get like a Jeep and go, like, fight for fun. It was like a vacation.
Well,
Come up in that.
here's what I think was going on with the Saudis, because it wasn't it was there was a pretty big media campaign that the Saudis started, whereby this was in obviously the 70s and 80s. Um, people who were Saudis and other people in the region and beyond who were Muslim, who were more religious minded, they would say, "Hey, these are our brothers and sisters being attacked and invaded in Afghanistan by communist, godless Soviets, right? We need to support them." So whether that means financial support or even going yourselves and fighting alongside them. And so there were a lot of people, not just from Saudi Arabia but across the region, who just normal people who decided, hey, I just want to go and fight the Soviets. And because they felt that that was the right thing to do, they had this bond that they felt that they with the Afghans, that they were being oppressed, obviously, and that they needed to help them. So um,
Yeah.
I think a big part of that also was for the Saudis to brandish their Islamic, quote unquote, Islamic credentials, and so show show the Muslim world, look, we are such pious people, not the Saudi people, I mean, but the Saudi government. We're such a pious government, and we are the leader of the Islamic world, right?
Yeah.
Look at
Well,
what we're doing. We are defending Muslims in oppressed Muslims in different parts of the world. And I think, but more importantly, it's distracting people from looking inwards at the shit
yeah,
inside Saudi
that
Arabia.
it was a steam valve,
Yeah.
essentially. It was a steam valve where you're letting off the steam because this was coming after like 1979, when you had young Saudi, like militants take over Mecca, and it became a giant like hostage situation. It was a huge thing, the siege of Mecca. And so they needed to do something about all of these radicalized youth that had been um, steeped in the ideologies of like radical uh, Islamist thinkers
But
that were
also
that
in
were
that
just like,
they saw that the Saudi royal family was illegitimate, and that they did not deserve to control the holy sites. And
yeah,
so
but that, well, I mean, that's what the ideologue said, and this was the problem, was that like there was a major challenge to the Saudi family as like rulers of the holy sites and rulers of the Islamic world. So it's like, what do you do with all of these young people that have this religious zealotry and anger?
including the Bin Ladens were involved in the Mecca
Yeah,
takeover.
yeah. So the point is, like, what do you do with these people that are angry, that feel betrayed by their government, feel their government is not representing their religious values? Send them to Afghanistan, which is
Yeah.
why the Saudi government, like totally not only turned the other, looked the other way when this was happening, but they facilitated Saudi citizens going to Afghanistan and like going to the black market and buying a gun, buying an AK-47, and joining the fight. And they, sort of allowed that rallying of, Saudis, and then this is where Osama bin Laden gets involved. So all
Yeah.
these like rich ass Saudis go to Afghanistan in the 80s, and this is, I mean, it's like just right after, 79, 70. They start going there to go on like basically jihad tour and shoot a few bullets and think you're cool. A lot of these guys, they didn't really see that much action. They'd get a gun, shoot around for a while, and then go home.
But there were people who did take it seriously.
Yeah,
And
and
there were a
Osama bin
lot
Laden,
of, the
that
thing
was
is that
Osama.
there were a lot of connections made in Afghanistan not just amongst Saudis, but amongst other Arabs, like-minded Arabs
Yeah.
who followed the same radical thinkers and ideologues, as well as Afghans. So it was this meeting place of all of these
Yeah, and
people.
it was,
And so what you saw eventually, it was like, yeah, okay, yeah, you they took part in the repelling of the Soviets. Eventually the Soviets were expelled, right? And
yeah,
so
and the
then
American
what?
CIA and American weapons were used.
Right.
You
But then
know,
what was the aftermath? And here is where it gets interesting. So was it 89? 89 that
the Taliban took
the
over,
no, that the
or
Soviets were expelled. I think it was
yeah, I think they probably withdrew around like because like I mean the Soviet Union fell, like
89. Yeah,
disbanded,
it was 89.
and
So in 1989, so beyond that, so you had a good 4 or 5 years before the Taliban really emerged as
they
this
weren't the major opposition group, which is
No, but here's what I think happened is that you had with all these people who showed up and made these connections with local Afghans. You also had the Wahhabi establishment. So aside from the Saudi government, what people need to understand is you have this balance of power sort of that was taking place in had been taking place in Saudi Arabia between the political power and then the religious power. Religious power being the Wahhabi religious establishment. So when the war ended, there was still like interest in Afghanistan
well, it
by
almost, I mean, it really, in some ways, you could kind of say it never really ended. I mean, except for when the Taliban had an iron grip on
Right,
the
but these
country.
people wanted to spread their Wahhabi ideas, so they were the ones who were building schools. They were the ones who were building the mosques where
Well,
they were sending their imams and all that stuff.
yeah,
Now,
but also, I mean, the Taliban were, you know what I mean? They were late to the party.
right, but
There were
what I'm
guys that
getting at.
came in like, they like the more zealous you are, the more authentic you seem.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that eventually it got to a point in the 90s that
Hmm.
these people who had been in Afghanistan, who were foreigners, who weren't Afghan, and took part in that fight, or were connected to the Wahhabi establishment, or maybe not like the because the Wahhabi establishment was maybe not in an official manner, but unofficially very much involved in the sponsoring of terrorism. And
Yeah.
so the idea is when these people when the Soviet Union fell, it was like, all right, well, now we turn our attention to the greater Satan, the United States, because yeah, they helped us take down the Soviets in Afghanistan, but they're supporting the Saudi royal family, and they're supporting Israel, and oppressing our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and the list goes on. There are a lot of anti-American grievances in that part of the world, and
But
so
I mean, it wasn't really the Afghans that were doing
no,
the
but they provided the
international
space.
action.
They provided the space. So
They provided a safe zone. It was
those people needed a place to operate it out of. And so, at some point, Osama bin Laden was operating out of Sudan. And in the
yeah, no, that's it.
Sudan
Like
got
when
Sudan got placed on like a list, and they had sanctions placed on it, the U.S. sanctions, and even the U.S.
well, not
launched
only
attacks on
sanctions.
Sudan until they said, "Hey, Bin Laden, you have to leave," and that's when he went back to Afghanistan.
Yeah, because
So
it wasn't just sanctions. It was like when and this was what, like 99 or something,
it was like
1999.
96. It was earlier than
But
that. It
like the
was like
USS Cole. When the USS
that
Cole
was
attack happened, that was
okay.
like 98, 99 or something, I think.
That was let me see. Exploded. I think it was 2000. It says here
Was it
2000.
2000? Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. That was like at that time, Osama bin Laden was in Sudan, and he had a big compound. In fact, they sent uh, Jamal Khashoggi over there, like to the Saudi royals sent Jamal Khashoggi to go talk to him and be like, "Hey, man, like take it easy." Right before the USS Cole thing, and then the American response was to bomb like pharmaceutical factories
Then.
in Sudan and I think in Kenya.
Well, they claimed that those factories were producing chemicals to
Yeah,
use
they
for
weren't.
chemical weapons. They weren't, obviously.
They found that they weren't.
They were producing pharmaceuticals for poor
But you
people.
know, Bill Clinton and whatever, just like shoot some missiles
Yeah,
into the
yeah.
thing, and you know, and then Osama went back to
Wasn't
Afghanistan
that
like
when the
with his
whole
own
Monica
family.
Lewinsky thing was happening too?
Well, the Monica Lewinsky thing was sort of resolved by then.
Okay.
That was more like Bosnia.
Took place. Wait. That this political scandal took place in '98. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah, you're right. You're right. So,
it was more like the Bosnian War, which
okay,
actually I was reading. That could be another thing we could talk about in one of these sessions, like Bosnia, because that's I was reading some interesting stuff about that recently.
yeah.
Um,
But they provided the space. Afghanistan provided the space, and
yeah,
the Taliban gave that like legitimacy to Bin Laden and the others to be welcomed in Afghanistan and to feel
yeah,
free to operate.
they had a clubhouse. It was
Yeah,
a fucking terrorist clubhouse.
yeah. So there
Even
is a
though the
distinction.
Afghans weren't really that involved
There is a
in
distinction.
international
Yeah,
terrorism,
but
but
let's
they had a club. They were like the bartenders at the clubhouse.
right. But I also want to get into well, when the US decided after 9/11
Hmm.
to go in, what happened there? So we know that that the Taliban were removed from power. You know, they
Sort of.
well from like they were no
Yeah,
longer
from
in control
central,
of
from
Kabul.
Kabul, and like from
Yeah.
central,
They didn't control the central government. So they created the Americans created a government that is loyal to the U.S., of course, and to the
Hmm.
West, very corrupt, um,
Yeah.
but
Well, this is.
supposedly democratic. And
Mm-hmm.
so the idea was that they would go in, and I think that it was to prove to the American population, like, look, hey, we're going in and we're defeating terrorism, right? And go and that's the thing. And so they went on this whole 20-year rampage of just trying to like find these find Al Qaeda, which is like such a loose concept, and to defeat the Taliban, but they never did. Al Qaeda morphed into something else, and other groups came up that were born out of Al
And then
Qaeda.
you have like the Islamic State of Khorasan,
Yeah, and then
which is basically ISIS in Afghanistan.
from that ideology, out of that was born the Islamic State in Iraq, which out of that was born ISIS, and then you had like Boko Haram and all those other groups. They all
There,
stem ideologically from that. So that's what I mean when I say that it's an idea that you can't defeat.
yeah, you
It's
can't
not. It's not. Yeah, you need
you
to.
can't defeat an idea without a better idea.
Right. The point is that as long as millions and millions of people are angry and are suffering, because of Western support for their autocratic governments, then you're going to have that. That's just how it works, and what's been happening. That's kind of what's developed now. What the big thing that we've been hearing about lately had been, well, will the US pull out? And now Biden announced that yes, we're pulling out. They pulled out of the Bagram Air Force Base. I think they have until the fall to pull out of the rest of the country completely. But
They're shooting for like sometime in August, I think.
right, but
But
the question that I keep coming across is why should the US pull out? So here's the thing: you have a lot of people, I think, in Washington, in the foreign policy establishment. You have a lot of uh, even local Afghans who are like against the American withdrawal. And so every time I think that even when Obama and Trump thought of pulling out, there was this resistance to the idea. But now that Biden has said no, I'm pulling out. This is an unwinnable war, and there's no point. We're not nation building. That's what the response he gave was. But I want to get into it a little deeper than that as to why the American presence has lasted so long and why there are a lot of people who don't want the American presence to end. And that
Yeah.
is, I was, I actually came across an interview that was given by a guy, American guy who's, I think he's former military intelligence and former CIA,
Hmm.
and he was in the military, and he had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the question was just that, what I had just asked. And so his response was, look, you have a lot of interests, financial interests that are tied to the American presence and to this war. And I'm not talking about the big, weapons manufacturers, which of course they're benefiting. We know that, whether they're
Yeah.
making fighter jets or Humvees or what have you. Uh, but you have a lot of smaller contractors
Yeah.
who, wherever the US military goes, whether it was in Afghanistan, whether it was in
They
Iraq,
build little buildings and
they
bullshit.
build the buildings, they provide the meals, they are the suppliers, they do the logistics, all the shit that the American government or the American military either is not capable of doing themselves, don't have the time, or are just uninterested in doing themselves. Or, and this is where the corruption is. I think this is the main reason, is because there are a lot of those people who are on Capitol Hill in Washington, connected to the military, or who are ex-military, who benefit from the military not doing these jobs, these
Yeah, they
tasks.
private industry gets like
Right.
kickback, and then they'll contribute to senatorial
Exactly. So
campaign.
imagine this. In Iraq, they at some point I came across a statistic that said that there was a contractor that was supplying the military or the soldiers with paper cups, and that every paper cup was costing $100, taxpayers' money. And the same thing with like nails and like
Yeah,
basic
no, I mean, no, it
and
was such a cash grab.
so
Both
so
of
so
those wars
yeah.
were total cash grabs for all these companies. They overpriced and millions of dollars. They were like pallets of money,
I
like
know.
literally a pallet, a
Mhm.
wood pallet, and that's usually about like 48 inches, like stacked with money. Disappeared.
Yeah. I have a friend who used to live in Dubai, who he was working in the coffee industry, so he was like, this completely separate. He had nothing to do with this, but
Mm,
he because there is an American military presence in Dubai, and because those a lot of those soldiers who go to Dubai end up going to Afghanistan or used to go to Iraq or still do.
mm.
Imagine this: because he was in the food and beverage industry, he would hear that there were American contractors that were providing food, like meals, daily meals for soldiers. They were like serving them fucking lobster. You're serving a kid from Kansas who's there to who's a soldier, feeding them lobster and steaks and shit in a fancy like buffet, like hotel buffet setting, on
Mm.
a daily basis, right? And
Mhm.
so So the point is that you had a lot of people making a lot of money. And so if that withdrawal would happen, right? You were going to have a lot of people who are upset because the money would stop flowing. And that meant also local Afghans who were benefiting from the kickbacks and all that. And
Yeah.
so then that worked its way into the lobbyists on Capitol Hill who were working day and night to convince the right politicians and the right Congress people to keep the war going.
And that's not even touching on the opium and heroin industry, because the poppy flowers that you use to make opium and heroin are grown in Afghanistan, and that's where,
Yeah.
like, that's Russia gets a lot of their, and Russia has a big, heroin problem. And where do they get it from? Where are the raw materials? So
Right.
they have interest in keeping that up, and Russia's always got it, poking around in there.
Yeah.
Um,
And so my
and
my
the
point is that like if we want to understand why things have lasted as long as they have, I mean, look at the media coverage.
it,
I mean,
I mean, the reason why it's lasted this long is because people are making money off of it.
people are making money, and I mean, it's no surprise. Why is it that people forgot about Afghanistan, right? Unless you had like a brother or a cousin who's in the military who's going to Afghanistan, who
But
probably who you may not even remember went, but unless they got shot or killed or maimed or something, then you
no,
it would stick in your mind. But the idea is also the media wouldn't cover it. Like why the media would never talk about
very,
Afghanistan.
yeah. After, like, after Iraq, like, Afghanistan became second tier. Um, the point is, like, yes, military families, this has impacted them, and they remember, people that have lost limbs, people that have lost their lives, their families remember. The culture doesn't remember because they decided to move on. And that's what's sick about it, is like, to go into a country and invade. And frankly, if you wanted to nation build, if you wanted to, unseat the Taliban and nation build in Afghanistan, like, uh, the Iraq War was such a fucking bad move, which it was a bad move anyway. Like, it was ridiculous and pointless, and just caused millions of deaths, and didn't really achieve anything, except for, like, oh, we got Saddam, we didn't like him, he was a bad guy. But you know what I mean? Like, I mean, like, you can't, like, you start, this is what really is obnoxious about these wars, is like, you start these wars and they become never ending catastrophes for the people that live in these countries, and then you refuse to take responsibility for any of it and be like, well, we can leave at any time.
So with what I was saying earlier about Biden saying that
Mhm.
we are not there to make nation build, obviously that's a lie. That's not what the US military and the US government said in the first place when they went into Afghanistan. They
But they
did say
weren't, though.
they wanted to create a new government, and that is nation building, right? So
Yeah, except they weren't really very, like, they didn't really take that much interest. They're like,
no,
any
no,
gangster, any gangster that shows up,
any
it's like,
warlord.
okay, you can be minister of something.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
they weren't really involved in the nation building part of it.
Because here's the thing: when again, when we hear from different sources, or we hear like I read from different
Mhm.
opinions and different news outlets, and well, more like opinion pieces and
Sure.
newspapers arguing against the American withdrawal and how that's going to affect the locals after the Taliban take over. The first thing that comes to my mind, and these are Western media sources, right? So just to be
Sure.
clear, the first thing that comes to my mind is you motherfuckers never cared about the local Afghans to begin with, right?
You never asked them what they
You never
wanted.
cared about the Afghans, never cared about the Iraqis. The only reason why these wars were started was for profit, right? In the case of Iraq, it was also to extract resources. But the idea, as we've just said, is that you have a lot of different interests who are politically connected, who are making a shit ton of money during these wars. And it's not
Mhm.
about any political objective. It's not about creating any sort of strategic advantage or benefiting any allies or anything like that. It is purely for profit. And the sad reality is that a lot of people, a lot of Americans sadly fell for that. And you have a lot of, I mean, I imagine that there are a lot more Americans today who wouldn't fall for that shit because we're $2 trillion were spent in Afghanistan, and yet we don't have good bridges and roads here in America. The homeless population is exploding. The problems are endless, and yet there are these people who are, again, politically connected, who've become filthy rich out of these wars.
Yeah, and it's the people that are making the decision. It's the people that are making the decision to go to war that are making money, and that should not be, you know, okay. That should not. That is a conflict of interest. If you're a congressperson voting for war, or if you are the defense secretary, or the secretary of state, or the vice president, Dick Cheney,
Yeah.
like you should not have vested financial interests in, you know, in these companies that are going to make money off of it, like Blackwater, like, whatever.
Halliburton.
Halliburton, yeah, exactly. Like, if you have vested interests in companies that make money off of war, you should you should have to divest from those before you serve as a public, as a senator, as a secretary of something, or as a vice president. You should have to give up all of your financial vested interests in these companies. That should be a no fucking brainer, you guys. Like, come on. Like
Yeah,
that.
but I think that Trump showed just how, like, he pushed it to the
How
limit,
far you can go?
how far you can go. But yeah, I think that Cheney, I don't like. I know that he had obviously had vested interest in Halliburton, but he didn't have like an official position until after he
No, he had one before,
well,
and then
but
he
not,
stepped
not when he
down.
was not when he was vice president. I think that was like pushing it too far, but it didn't make a difference. It's fucking bullshit. He had a massive stake in that company. But the thing is that this just goes to show how corrupt and just how much stink comes out of this system, right? When so we're talking about these companies, but what about the big weapons manufacturers, right?
Oh yeah.
Those guys need a war every few years. Those guys need a new war every 10 years or 15 years. And so the fact that they are the ones, these are one of so the contractors, government contractors and weapons manufacturers are one of a few industries that are part of like this conglomerate of industries in America that are untouchable and are so
No, and there's
wealthy.
a correlation.
It's a
Like
cartel. It's a
it's the current,
cartel.
yeah,
These
and
guys,
it's
these
the
guys
weapon
go in
manufacturers.
these guys go in and they pay for the senators and the congress people for their campaigns. It doesn't matter whether they're a Democrat or
Yeah.
Republican. They don't give a
And
shit.
it's the oil companies, the weapons manufacturers, they
The
all have the same
pharmaceuticals,
interests.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And let me just as a disclaimer here to anyone who's skeptical, this these are not what we're saying right now. These are not weird conspiracy theories that we got off of 4chan or something. This is documented history. Like all of this is actually like public information, and it's very obvious. And we're not just spouting bullshit conspiracy theories. Um, the money trail is very clear.
I mean, and
And
if anyone wants to really go and look back at the history to just know how serious this is, President Eisenhower talked about the military industrial complex and just how threatening that would be to American democracy, right? And so I know there are a lot of people who know this, people have talked about this, but for those who don't, go back, check out Eisenhower and what he said about the.
originally Eisenhower's speech was going to he was going to say the military industrial congressional complex.
Oh, really?
He was going to throw in Congress too, and some advisor or something told him like, yeah, don't throw Congress under the bus. But it was originally going to be the military industrial congressional complex.
Yeah.
Fun
Yeah.
fact.
I mean, uh, this is part of the fabric of the political system in America since lobbying was founded in, was it the 30s, 20s? I think it was the 20s. I could be wrong, 20s or 30s. But the idea is that you have a revolving door of interests, of commercial interests in this country, the big corporations who go through Congress spending tons of money and getting everything that they want, right? And they're the ones pulling the strings.
Yeah,
And
legislators are bought and sold.
right. And so unless there are politicians who have been talking about this quite a bit, get money out of politics. That's how serious this is. The reason why you will have these endless wars and trillions of dollars spent abroad and so many people
That
profiting
achieve
off of
nothing for
that
the
achieve nothing,
American
and then you
people.
have countless people dying or losing limbs and all that, is because of this corruption, right? So
Yeah.
so
And
yeah,
what do the American people get out of it?
absolutely nothing. Like,
They
it's
get to
already forgotten. People are already. I was reading about this today. Afghanistan will be just another thing that people will just avoid talking about in the government, in
and
Congress, in
because
the foreign policy establishment. It's like it never happened. It's like it
and
never
it
happened.
lasted 20 years.
Right, but
20 years.
they're
But
going to
because
they're
it
going to
didn't affect
pretend.
there are a lot of people that didn't get affected directly by
Right,
it.
but the people in the government are
Mhm.
going to act like it never
Yeah,
happened.
they're just gonna sweep it under the rug and be like, My bad.
Yeah.
No,
And that's another, but you see also how the repetition of this, more trillions and more trillions being spent on these endless wars, and America's debt just soaring. Its
and they're
overall debt
no,
is
and
soaring.
people
This
throw
is
a
this is
fit.
how empires fall. This
Yeah.
is this is the how
Well,
empires crumble.
and they're like you have fucking senators and fucking talking heads throwing a fit about stimulus packages and money for social programs for the American people, for and social security and fucking healthcare and that kind of stuff, and they throw a fit about like, oh, how expensive it is, and we shouldn't be going into debt, and we need to everybody pays for their own way, blah blah blah. And it's like the amount of money it takes to fly a drone and drop a bomb. Like, how many kids you could feed with that? And there are kids who are hungry in America.
Yeah. Places
There
with
are,
nuclear clean water, places that are more like, are less developed than very underdeveloped countries.
Yes, I mean, like you go to like in Michigan where the water is fucking polluted, or like every day I go through downtown Los Angeles, and the amount of tents of homeless people, just it's a tent city. It's like, am I going through downtown Los Angeles, the home of Hollywood and one of the richest cities in the world, or am I in Syria?
Well,
What
yeah, I
the
mean,
fuck?
you don't have diseases spreading in Syria, whereas like here, you because of the homeless situation, the lack of sanitation, the lack of government, involvement, city government involvement, you actually have diseases starting to spread.
Yeah, you have a hepatitis outbreak.
Mhm.
There was a big one in San Diego, and then there was one in Los Angeles. Like,
Yeah, you're not. Yeah,
and
like yeah, they had a mass, like they had a polio outbreak in Syria years ago, which is crazy because polio was eradicated, but that country was in a civil war, like was in an uprising, and there was war and all that, like all
yeah,
these
I mean, there
problems.
was
It was like Armageddon in Syria.
yeah, it
And-
was civil war and fucking Armageddon, and
right,
you
but
can't like if like if you have similar problems in America, that's something that should give us pause. We need
yeah,
to stop and look at, like, how can we be living at the center of like international global empire. Like, we are the most powerful. The United States is the most powerful country, militarily speaking, at least,
economically
and,
too.
and economically.
Still,
Like, really, we're supposed to be the center of power and money in the world, and somehow you go through the streets of the cities, and you could be like, depending on what neighborhood you're in, like, you're not going to see it in Beverly Hills,
no.
but
God
you go downtown, Broadway, Boulevard downtown, like it's a tent city. It's a
forbid.
disgrace that could happen. It's like you go from uh, something that you'd see on like the show Entourage, some like bullshit Hollywood crap. You drive down a few miles and suddenly you're in fucking Djibouti. You're in fucking Somalia or Syria. Like you're in it looks like a fucking refugee camp,
Yeah.
because it is, because I mean, like, that's what it is. These people have nowhere to go, and you have people walking around half naked, yelling and screaming, and some of them are involved in crime, and some of them are just have mental disorders, and some of them are just poor. But I mean, you make a mixture of all of that, and it's a mixture for disaster, and it makes a filthy, broken city. And every study has shown that, like, when you house the homeless, when you get them off the streets and you give them like affordable housing and put them in some kind of transitional housing, they can get themselves on their feet to some degree, and it saves the city money, and it saves the city the problem of dealing with tent cities, and it takes crime off the street. It works.
Yeah, then the problem with that is your war on drugs and shit like that. Again, more money being funneled into militarizing police
Yeah,
and
but I mean, it's been shown that, like, decriminalizing drugs actually saves money, and it gets actually the drugs off the street,
but
instead of like
it's not about
arresting people
the
for
drugs
having
getting
drugs.
off. It's not about the drugs getting off the street or saving money. It's about certain people profiting.
Yeah, and it's like about the lives that are destroyed by an industry by criminal industry. Like, when you criminalize drugs, you create a criminal industry,
Mhm.
and there are criminals who will take advantage of that, and they hurt people. And when people have addiction problems and drug addictions, and owe money to their drug dealers, or like just scratching themselves and looking for their next fix, that creates crime. It makes people like do things that they wouldn't necessarily do, and it empowers the drug dealers.
Yeah, but I think in the bigger sense, it's turning this country into very sick country, right?
Yeah,
And there are a lot of other things that are going on that are turning this country into a very sick country, including
yeah,
like gun ownership, and look, you get like into so many of them. But the idea is that there is no sense of um, there is no sense of prioritizing the interests of the country and the people. And so that's what you have when you have a corrupt system, and
yeah.
trying to fix that is not easy at all. And so going back to Afghanistan, it's like, well, that happened. That was true. $2 trillion wasted. No objectives were accomplished. There was no benefit or
After
gain.
20 years, what do we get? The Taliban is taking over again.
Yeah, yeah. It's like you're going back to square one. Exactly
Like, you
that.
spent 20 years, how many lives were lost? How many limbs were lost? How
Mhm.
many like families were destroyed, and villages and cities and American families were destroyed by this war for 20 years.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like, kids that were born when this war started are now like adults.
yeah. And so,
Like, their whole lives this was happening,
but I
and there
think,
wasn't even that much reporting on it. Like,
yeah,
they probably, like a lot of people who were born when this started, you really didn't pay much attention to the whole thing, because it was just something that we did, and we don't really talk about it that much.
right.
It's only an impact. It has impact on people that actually had to serve in the military. People that were there, and then it was like, we'll just close the bathroom door there.
Yeah,
Like, there's
but
poop in there.
the thing is, I do see that military adventurism
Mm.
is becoming very costly politically for politicians. A lot of people are waking up and seeing that any kind of foreign intervention is something that they don't care for. And I think that, especially with all the problems that we have locally, domestically, and the fact that people have very little trust in the government, in Congress, in politicians, and yeah,
Well,
it's become a situation where the problems are so bad that unless attention is focused domestically, there are a lot of politicians who are losing their seats, you
I
know?
mean, this is part of the appeal of Donald Trump, is this the narrative of nativism, of like, why are we involved in foreign? Who the fuck are these people? We don't even know these people.
Well, I
You
mean,
know what I mean?
but to be fair though, it doesn't. Yes, Donald Trump presented it in a nativist context for sure. But then you have other politicians who were saying kind of the similar thing, which was
Sure,
that, but it
but
wasn't
Trump.
nativist. It wasn't nativist. It was that, hey, we have problems. We have serious problems here. Yeah, we do. We are for the idea of sending humanitarian aid to other countries and all that. But what
Sure,
about us? We have been left
yeah,
behind.
no, there is a balance where we can we have the wealth and we have the power to help other countries and help other societies, but most of our adventures overseas are not actually helping, and they're actually hurting Americans as much. Well, not as much as they're hurting the native population, because they're killing a lot of people overseas.
But this is
Um,
what breeds more terrorism.
it breeds terrorism because people have resentment about American involvement in foreign conflicts.
Yeah.
And so, like, I, on the one hand, I think when we're talking about foreign conflicts, um, I it would be nice if the U.S. didn't get militarily involved in a lot of things, or if they did, that they planned it out well and had a real objective and a real exit strategy. And but generally they go in guns blazing without a real plan, a real objective, a real exit strategy, and you get into this endless war. And this is the same thing we see with like Vietnam. Is different. Like if you look like World War II, um, it was like, okay, we need to defeat the Nazis.
Yeah,
This
but
is our thing, and then we're gonna help rebuild afterwards.
so
The Marshall Plan.
right. So here's what I'll say. Going back to that interview I was telling you about, the military intelligence guy who was interviewed, what he was saying was that he would talk to people in Iraq who were in the intelligence and military services there, and you had a lot of them who were telling him, look, we want to work with you. So these are people who are friendly to the US, right? I mean, this is a guy who, is trying to advance US interests, whatever.
Sure.
But these guys were telling him, look, we want to work with you. We are trying to work with you. But the problem is that we, we you guys don't have a strategy. You don't have objectives.
And every 4 years, your
right.
complete worldview changes.
There's that, but then also it gets to the point where he was saying, this same Iraqi official was saying, I get visits from the Pentagon, so military officials from the Pentagon, officials from the CIA, and officials from the State Department. Separate delegations with who are not in coordination with each
They're
other.
just saying different
All
things.
have completely different missions and completely different objectives, and it's a fucking shit show.
You like, get your shit together.
That just shows you how defunct and disorganized and inefficient and basically just lacking of any sense of direction or purpose the US government has, right? And so so imagine that's abroad. What about here? There is no
like they're not fucking talking to each other.
No, because it doesn't matter.
Like different agencies in the American government don't talk to each other, and they have different agendas.
Right,
and
but that's the point. It's meant to be that way. It's meant to be that way because there are a lot of people in those agencies or connected to those agencies who benefit from the status quo. So
or from this, like this one's benefiting from this thing, but this one's one's benefiting from the oil industry, one is benefiting from something else. Like,
right,
I mean, like,
right.
It's like you guys need to fucking coordinate. This is the same thing they had after 9/11. The problem they had was like if the FBI and the CIA and if they were communicating with each other in a normal way that you'd think they would, they would be on top of the situation. But they're acting like they're football teams who are competing.
And the other thing is the rebuilding effort. You make a good point. I think that
where's the Marshall Plan for the Middle East after you fucking bomb them?
No Marshall Plan for the brown people, right? I mean,
like, look, Nazi Germany.
The exception to that, because there is a lot of racist elements to that, where they go in, they bomb a country, they destroy it completely, and don't give a shit.
Yeah.
The exception to that is Japan, but they
And in
nuked.
South Korea.
But they nuked Japan. They
Yeah,
fucking
they
nuked.
fucking nuked Japan.
Yeah.
But but like look at and look at like Germany, like Nazi Germany. They destroyed Nazi Germany. They were Nazis. You had to fucking destroy them a little bit.
But they were simple.
But they rebuilt Germany.
But and there were
And
Nazis.
that's why the Nazis didn't show up again in Germany until like recently.
There were former Nazis after the fall and defeat of Germany who escaped.
Well, they all went to like work for
those
NASA.
who escaped to Latin America. You had those who escaped to the U.S. and they were left untouched. No one got to them, and because okay, yeah, I mean these guys are they're kind of
It was like if they were rocket scientists, they got hired by NASA.
No, but I'm talking about like people who were in the fucking SS. Like it's you come across stories like that, and you're like, well, why were these people left alone? Why were they not hunted down? Why were they not prosecuted? And you can't help but think, well, there's a racist element there. Why is it that
they didn't send them to Guantanamo.
Why is it that Japanese Americans were put in concentration camps, right? Whereas German Americans and Italian Americans weren't.
Interesting point that you bring up there, sir.
I mean, is it like
what an interesting quandary that you what could be the difference? I don't know. Is it something about the shape of their eyelids or the tone of their skin? I don't know. I mean, some eyelids are more dangerous than others.
Some fascists are more dangerous than others. Some are more fascist. Some fascists are more fascist than others.
Some people are more easy to hate than others.
Yeah. And that's the situation.
They're easier to dehumanize.
With Afghanistan,
they look more different.
That is exactly what it is.
They look different enough that they're easier to hate or easier to not give a fuck about. And that's how they roll.
Yeah.
That's how it goes. And it's horrendous. But it's like you look at the they can always cite the successes and then be like, well, the failures, that was just sorry, didn't work out the way we thought.
They'll never apologize. They won't.
I don't really say sorry, but it's like didn't really work the way we thought it was, but whatever. Hoorah!
Whatever, bro.
Oh, sorry, bro. Peace, bro. But interestingly, I was in my reading earlier today in preparation for this podcast. I was there's an interesting comparison that I don't think would seem logical, or like the first thing that would come to the mind of most people when talking about Afghanistan is that I think Switzerland is an interesting parallel. Switzerland, is a landlocked country in the middle of Europe who has survived between like warring empires.
Yeah.
And the French and the Germans and British, and it has a mixed population of people that speak different languages and different have different religions. They had a very, they had their warrior period, and then they just decided to sort of stop being a part of the regional wars and be neutral. They exported a lot of, they're one of their major exports. Like people think of Switzerland as a place where they just like said they're making chocolate and clocks, watches, and army knives. But they exported a lot of mercenaries during like the Napoleonic Wars and that kind of stuff. That was one of their major exports.
Was mercenaries.
Mercenaries, yeah, like guns for hire. However, they never took a stance in the wars. And interestingly enough, Afghanistan didn't, as much as the Axis and the Central Powers and the Allied powers, like they tried to pull Afghanistan into the world wars. Afghanistan played no role in either of the world wars,
Hmm.
and they were relatively peaceful. So there, it's kind of a similar thing. Like, it's a mountainous region that's in between a number of empires that are fighting for domination of the region, and they all want to get access to those mountain passes. And
Very few are actually able to control those
yeah,
lands.
and Switzerland got off easy,
I mean,
partly by giving some concessions to Nazis and letting them store their gold in their banks, without saying a word, that kind of thing. But Afghanistan is similar. It's a mountainous region in between empires that are fighting for domination, and everyone's trying to fight out their regional battles in that country, because they think, like, well, if we get this, because the major strategic value is just where it is, between Pakistan and India, and you know um
And it's an open
and Russia,
country.
and all that.
Things can
you
go
know
in and out really easy.
yeah, if you have control of it.
Hmm.
India has opened up diplomatic channels to the Taliban, because they now want to, they're like, these guys might have some serious power in the next government, and they're hedging their bets. But the point is, like, it's strategic in terms of being in the center of so many different blocks of power.
Well, and you see it also in terms of how Afghans like look physically. They're so diverse. You have, I mean, over millennia of so many different civilizations and empires ruling over Afghanistan.
Or
You
just,
have,
yeah, just passing through or ruling. But yeah, I
yeah,
mean, like,
you
you had
have people who are
Indians, you
like
had Iranians, you had, like,
blonde skin. I mean, blonde hair, blue eyes, white skin. You have people who are looking more Asian looking, Central
yeah,
Asian
more
looking,
Mongolian looking.
everything in between. It's
Everybody's been through there. But I mean, I think there's a sort of, I think their identity comes a lot from just from the geographical landscape, from, like, we are the people that live here, and
Mhm.
other people can come in and, like, contribute to the gene pool and hang out for a little while, but for the most part, and it's like, our identity is the people that live here. And but they're very, you know they're they have a strong sense of patriotism, and it's not like a racial patriotism for the most part, it
Mhm.
seems, to my knowledge.
Well,
Like, there's
there's no
Pashto,
real,
like, but
yeah.
I mean, there are different ethnic
There is
groups,
an
but
ethnic divide, yeah.
yeah, and it's gotten worse. And really, like, when did it get bad like that? Not to say not to say that everything bad in the world goes back to British imperialism, but British imperialism didn't help, and they always exacerbated, like, the British East India Company and British imperialism always exacerbated racial tensions.
Mhm.
And there were eras in like I touched on earlier, like, there are eras in Afghan history where you had Buddhists and Sunni Shia Muslims living together. You had Kafiristan,
Mhm.
and I mean, they weren't at war with each other, and they managed to like live and trade with each other like normal fucking people. So
Yeah, like
that's
many other places in the world that
that,
before you had, global colonization and imperialism that was spurred
that
by
that
Europe.
that deliberately took advantage of racial differences to
Mhm.
create animosity and to like favor one group over another. That
Yeah,
was,
yeah,
that was the program.
right.
Um, and
But,
it really like fucked shit up. I'm like, well, but whatever. Okay, you're just jolly British guys who'd like to drink tea. Oh, fancy a spot of tea?
yeah, well, I mean,
Fancy a spot of tea with a little Earl Grey? Cheerio.
cheerio. On that note, I mean, it's I think we're at a good point to end in that, like, wrap it up
Yeah,
in
I
that.
don't know how long we've gone right now, but I think in my natural sense of time, we probably hit that point.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
So
um for the listeners, uh I am getting more feedback, so keep sharing your feedback, and yeah, stay tuned for more episodes.
yeah, like we fully welcome everyone to give us feedback, talk shit, argue with us, insult us all you want. We have a thick enough skin to handle it, and we would like the feedback. And we'll respond and we'll talk back, and we'll have a conversation, even if you're insulting us. So feel free.
All right. Well, until next week then.
All
Thanks.
right,
Peace out.
Khaladia out.
Idea.
All right.